So, Matt Gaetz has become the living embodiment of the age-old cliche, a lawyer who speaks for himself has a fool for her client. As an attorney myself, who's the founding partner of a law firm and the litigation director and appellate director who handles both criminal defense for people who's been accused of similar conduct and has done a nationally recognized plaintiff's personal injury case where I represented a Stamford High School student against a teacher, female teacher, who was accused of similar conduct. I've seen both sides of this issue. So let's see how a real lawyer can interpret how Matt Gaetz has been behaving. First, I want to do an experiment. If I hold this up to you, what would you say that you see? 99.9% of you are going to say a black dot, even though 99.9% of what I'm showing you is white space. How is this relevant? We'll get into that. Well, let's talk about Matt Gaetz first, bearing in mind that nothing that I'm about to say represents legal advice, and everyone is entitled to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. We all know Matt Gaetz has never had an issue going on television and doing outrageous things to get himself in front of a camera. In addition, Matt Gaetz has never had an issue going on television to be a Trump apologist, apologizing for some of his most outrageous and horrible conduct. But yet, the Republican Party's response to the allegations against Matt Gaetz thus far has been less than full-throated. In fact, his only defenders thus far have been the famously jacketless congressman, who's also been accused of similar conduct, just involving an Ohio State wrestling doctor and Ohio State wrestling students, and his failure to report knowledge of similar conduct, and our favorite conspiracy theorist, QAnon believer, who, if we take her beliefs at face value, she would turn Smokey the Bear commercials into War of the Worlds. So, what are the facts? Well, the most important fact is Matt Gaetz' problems stem from his personal relationship with a man named Joel Greenberg. Joel Greenberg and Matt Gaetz were both elected around the same time, except Joel Greenberg was elected as the tax collector for Seminole County, Florida. Now, when Joel Greenberg first got indicted, he was indicted on 12 counts. He was indicted mostly for embezzling money and accessing the state websites in order to get access to that money and misuse it, for sex trafficking an underage girl, and for accessing expired IDs in order to make fake IDs, presumably possibly for that 17-year-old girl to move her across state lines. However, Mr. Greenberg, upon posting his bail, violated the conditions of his bond and had it revoked, which means he's now sitting in prison for the next however long until one of three things happen. Either A, he gets a trial, which could take quite a while in the time of COVID, B, he enters a plea, or C, he gives the state information that might help them in a more high-profile investigation, like, say, an investigation into Matt Gaetz. Now, what has Joel Greenberg been accused of doing? Well, in addition to the first 12 things and having his bond revoked, the feds have also decided to ratchet up and throw another 20 indictments onto his charges, which means Mr. Greenberg's looking at 32 separate federal charges right now as he sits in prison with less support than Matt Gaetz. So what did Matt Gaetz do upon learning that became public that he was not the target but the subject, which is basically a distinction without difference, of this investigation? Well, of course, he immediately went on television and went on to a television program and thought that he would get himself some help by, first of all, trying to implicate the host of the show by saying that he had been accused of similar conduct, which left the show's host looking confused and defenseful of what he was being accused of. Matt Gaetz also, without any hesitation, brought up a completely separate crime that was not even being discussed called pay-to-play, which is where a public official is paid money in order to take official acts, something that no one was talking about. And he also basically made the show's host a witness against him by saying that he had been out to dinner with Mr. Gaetz and his girlfriend, which we don't know if this is the alleged underage girl, which the show's host claims he has no recollection of whatsoever. As an attorney, I can tell you none of these things are helpful for Mr. Gaetz at all. But perhaps most importantly, one of the worst things that Matt Gaetz did is when the news broke that they had discovered receipts that Mr. Greenberg and Mr. Gaetz had paid for sex with, yes, overage women, Matt Gaetz publicly denied having ever paid for sex. Now, I know many of you are thinking, but Devin, why would it be a bad thing to deny having paid for sex with women? Well, that gets back to the black dot and the white space question. It's actually better to be much more general or not say anything at all. Your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination is the most important right that you have. And as a criminal defense attorney, the thing that we most often have to remind our criminal defendants of is it's not your job to prove your innocence. It's the state's job to prove your guilt. And even if you are innocent, and even if you're a witness, a target, or a subject of an investigation, it's very rarely ever in your best interest to engage in conversation or release statements regarding the police investigation. Because we all know that innocent people have been convicted on false confessions. Even when the mountain of forensic evidence has pointed to their innocence, juries just can't understand how an innocent person could possibly confess to a crime. And opening up the door by making a statement like, I've never paid for sex, when we know that the feds have receipts that prove that there were Apple Pay and Cash App payments to women, potentially for sex, from a website called Seeking Arrangements, it opens the door for the police to be able to bring Matt in and start questioning him and start investigating him and prove that he's committed a public lie. So it's best to either make general denials like, I'm innocent of all charges, or hire an attorney, let them do the talking for you because nothing they say can actually be attributed to you, and keep your mouth shut. So, what else has Matt Gaetz left to himself in this investigation? More mistakes by Gaetz have been unveiled in that he's been walking around Congress allegedly showing pictures, inappropriate pictures, of women that he's been engaged with to other fellow members while on the House floor. This has earned him the nickname, apparently, Creepy Gaetz. As an attorney, I can tell you this is not the kind of press that you want surrounding you when you're being accused of a crime. Additionally, he's also just had his communications director resign because she didn't feel it was ethical to remain on his staff. This looks very, very bad from a criminal defense standpoint for Matt Gaetz. Mr. Gaetz and Mr. Greenberg have both been engaged in what seems to be prostitution, but prostitution isn't a federal crime. So why would the feds be investigating prostitution if there's so far no proof that any of these girls were underage? Well, that's because he can still be convicted of sex trafficking on a federal level if for that prostitution there's been anything of value offered in order to coerce the adult into engaging in sex. And unfortunately for Mr. Gaetz, the news is broken that there was ecstasy involved. So if Matt Gaetz used ecstasy in order to get any of these girls to have sex with him, and they wouldn't have otherwise done so, and he paid for it, he's not guilty actually of, he is guilty of state prostitution charges, but he's also guilty of federal sex trafficking of an adult. Now, if the girls are underage, it's a much easier case to prove because all he has to prove is that they crossed state lines and that something of value was offered and the girl was underage. So as you can see, Matt Gaetz is currently facing many potential problems. But the biggest problem he has is that he just can't seem to keep his mouth shut. He can't seem to stay off of television. And he's done very bizarre things since being accused of these crimes. As an attorney who has extensive experience defending people in these matters, I can safely say that if I was given a choice between representing the potential victim in this case or representing Mr. Gaetz, I would feel much more comfortable representing the alleged victim than I would with Mr. Gaetz, although I would imagine the amount of money that would come from it would be relatively equal, regardless of which one I took on. I hope this has been helpful. If it has, leave a like, leave a comment. Feel free to let me know. Thanks.